at your entire life consists of basically sense perceptions, thoughts, and emotions. I think that's about it, right? Sense perceptions, thoughts, emotions. Put them together, mix them up. That's my life. Okay. So that applies to everybody. Now, the particular mixture differs from person to person. What exactly goes into the sense perceptions and the thoughts and the emotions varies slightly from person to person, but basically that's the mixture. Now, the question is, you can't escape that. Of course, that's normal life. Is there anything else? Sense perceptions, thoughts, emotions. Okay, let's see. There must be something else, because how do I know that there's sense perceptions, thoughts, and emotions? Is the ability to recognize, to have a sense perception based on thinking? No, because to have a sense perception, you don't really need to think. You can just look and see. So what else is there? And this is a key thing. There is something else apart from sense perceptions, thoughts, and emotions, which is, we could call it an awareness. There is a sense perception. There is an emotion. There is a thought. And that is, we could call that pure consciousness. Otherwise, how could you have a sense perception? So there is something there that enables sense perceptions to be there, that enables a thought to be there, that enables an emotion to be there. And that is the thing that in most humans is hidden. They don't know, in other words, they don't know it's there. Because that is presence, which we could also call consciousness, we could also call awareness. And that is the spiritual dimension, and that is the awakening. Once you realize that that is there, we could also describe that as the space for all those other things. Core of what spirituality means. Spirituality is not having a particular belief structure, is not subscribing to a particular set of thoughts. Spirituality is discovering a dimension within yourself that is, we can either say deeper or higher than the continuous movement of thinking. And of course, all this information and knowledge is experienced in you as thought. So the thinking mind has always been active for many thousands of years in humans, but now it's even more active than before because it gets energized by the incredible increase in input. Before, all you had was the simple sensory input in your immediate surroundings. Then later came books, so you have the added input of that. And then gradually came the mass media, and now this incredible revolution of information technology, computers, and so on. So it energizes that movement of thought that's taking place in every human, which in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It only becomes a bad thing and self-destructive thing if that is all you experience inside you, in your consciousness. If all you ever experience is that, I call it sometimes mental noise, then you begin to derive your identity from the thoughts in your head, what the thoughts tell you about yourself, and you are trapped in that identity that is based on identification with thinking. All spiritual teachings point to the possibility of finding something in you that is deeper than thinking, a space, a stillness that's always there. And the informational excess of information, you can only successfully deal with that if you have a balance in your consciousness between using your mind to absorb information, to put out new information, to work on the information that you have taken in, input. If you have a balance between that and something that is deeper than thought in you. And really, instead of giving you new knowledge here, I don't want to do that because I don't want to add to the knowledge that you're taking in anyway, far more than you ever need. So instead of giving you knowledge here, I'd like to suggest that you experience at first hand in yourself that place of, I call it sometimes a presence, where you are alert, conscious, but not thinking. I can just suggest to you 3 or 4 entry points into that state of consciousness, and after I've done that, we can carry on the conversation. A very simple entry point, and this is why my first book is called The Power of Now, is the realization that your entire life consists of the present moment and only the present moment ever. Now, most people, perhaps in some abstract way, they know that, but they cannot sense or feel the truth of that. And I'd like to invite you to actually sense and feel the truth of what I'm saying, which even if there's a great philosopher here, he cannot possibly argue, he or she cannot argue with this statement that whatever you experience ever is present moment. Your entire life unfolds in the present moment. That's all you ever have. Most people don't live as if this were true. They live as if the opposite almost were true, as if the future moment were more important always than the next one. And that happens because of excessive identification with thinking, because usually the thoughts are about the next thing, the next, or what could happen or might happen. So if you can just come to this realization, well, this is all I ever have and ever experience is this moment. This is undoubtedly true. There is nothing else ever. And at that moment, when you fully realize that, you can only realize that an alertness arises in you. Wow. You become alert to, one could almost call it, the presence of the power of this moment, of the power of life itself in this present moment. That reminds me of something I read in the New Testament, where he said, the kingdom of heaven does not come with signs to be perceived. You cannot say, it's over here, or it's over there. But truly, I tell you, the kingdom of heaven is within you. Somebody said that 2,000 years ago, but very few people in the churches understand the depth of it. It gets completely misinterpreted. But that's the depth of, that's the deepest spiritual teaching. Now that kingdom of heaven is that spaciousness that's in you, it cannot be observed as if it were a chair, because it is the observing agent. It is that which makes all observation possible. So it cannot become an object to itself, because it is the eternal subject, the I. It's consciousness itself, the light of the source, you could call it, the light of God, the light of the One. So when you're not being challenged, then you bring in that awareness. You become the awareness. You go into the present moment, perhaps, as I described just now, starting with sense perceptions. Become alert. An alertness is required to truly perceive things, and immediately things become more alive and less problematic when you go into sense perception, because the problematic dimension is in the head. And you go into sense perception, suddenly you go into the present moment, and in the present moment, problems disappear. Isn't that strange? So the mind says, well, I still have them. Well, yeah, when you start thinking about them, you have them again. But when you're not thinking about them, you have no problems. Now, some of you will argue with that, but let me explain. You have situations in your life that can be challenging, and you have to deal with these situations. But the only place where you can deal with the challenging situations is in the present moment. And dealing with a challenging situation in the present moment is not a problem. You're dealing with a challenging situation. You're facing it, you're looking at it. And that looking is important. What I call looking really is putting your attention on it, which is the power of consciousness. And while you're looking, you're not thinking. Every person who has achieved mastery in any field knows what I mean by looking, because there's that absolute presence, and then that person does what he or she does. It flows from that presence. So you look, there's no problem. Problem is when you dwell mentally on something that will happen, could happen, might happen. A problem that's something I have to face next week, but not now. And you're totally absorbed in that. That's a problem. An interesting thing, I may have even written that in The Power of Now. If you think you have problems, ask yourself, what problem do I have at this moment? But this moment really means this moment. And then you have to go, well, I've got all my wife, my ex-wife is suing me. I'm about to lose my home. Person close to me is ill. I might lose my job. I have to look for a new job. Okay, what problem do you have at this moment? You're breathing, feeling the aliveness in the body, looking around. Well, at this moment, I don't actually have a problem. You have to then admit, if you really go into the present moment, the problem cannot survive in the present moment. That's an amazing realization. Doesn't mean that you no longer deal with what you need to deal with. You deal with it when the moment comes more effectively, when you don't waste your life energy in the mental realm of creating problems that you cannot be dealt with at this moment. And if you wake up in the middle of the night thinking about your problems and what you can do about them, it's extremely unlikely that you find any solution by worrying at 4 o'clock in the morning about it. But if you became still at 4 o'clock in the morning and wake up and go into the inner energy field of the body rather than thinking about your problems, in other words, leave the dimension of problems, come deeply into the present moment, then perhaps the next morning when you wake up, you suddenly say, oh, I know what I have to do now. I know how I can deal with it now. And the right course of action happens because you've gone there, but not through the problem-making faculty in the human mind. So again, coming back to your question, when you're not being challenged, practice it. And then when you are being challenged by little things that goes wrong, so to speak, in daily life tends to happen. You might have noticed things don't always go according to your expectations. Sometimes you miss the bus, or something, you miss the plane, or something else goes wrong. It tends to happen actually quite a lot. It seems to be part of life. Something going wrong is part of how life experiences itself. And again, you can then bring awareness to that so that you don't always fall into reactivity when something goes wrong, but you immediately align with it. Or when people say, behave in a way that you find offensive, or they behave in a way that they create difficulties for you because you wanted this and they want something else, you don't have to go into hostility or opposition. You can immediately say, oh, you seem to say, this is what is. And then how can I approach that without the negativity and just accept that something has gone wrong? It's not wrong at all. It's called life. So something going wrong, really, what it means is it's called life. So you welcome every little challenge. So it's a shift in attitude, and then your practice becomes easier when you see you can almost welcome when things happen that before you called things going wrong. Little things and later big things. Oh, okay. And then you evolve, just as a character in a good movie.
Of the world, but high achieving to ourselves, meaning, did I get up out of bed today and what did I accomplish? And if I didn't accomplish anything, I'm a failure to myself. So I was wondering if you had any advice for those of us who don't have as much compassion for ourselves.
Okay, thanks. Well, yes, compassion for yourself, of course, is as important as compassion for others. When you, often I get asked questions like people who did something that they now realize was deeply wrong in the past. Sometimes people ask questions about they brought up their children in a way that they now realize was not very conscious, and so that they may have caused suffering to their children, or other people find they have caused suffering to loved ones and they now realize that what they did was wrong. And again, I say this is an example where you need to be compassionate with yourself, because no human being can act beyond their level of consciousness. So that was your level of consciousness at the time, and you could not go beyond that. And again here, to make demands upon yourself, up to a point it might be a good thing to if you, as long as you enjoy it, it's a wonderful thing. When the enjoyment of what you're doing is lost, then you have to be careful, because there you have to come to a stop and say, okay, there's something here that's not right, because I'm no longer enjoying what I'm doing. That's the danger. And so as long as you enjoy, you don't even need compassion. Don't listen to, some people have a very active mind. Maybe that's what Freud called the super ego, or some other entity that criticizes you. Some people have a particular function in their minds that's very critical of themselves. Perhaps everybody has it to some degree, but some people have it to a high degree, and that's a dreadful thing to live with. Living with a voice in your head that continually criticizes you and tells you you haven't done well enough, you're not good enough, you should have done better. I mean, if you had to live with a person like that, you would leave. I mean, it would be horrible to live with a person who continuously tells you these things, but if that thing is stuck in your head, what can you do? Now, what you can do is to become aware that all that it is, it's a particular pattern in your mind. It's a particular way in which your mind works. And so you could call it a sub-personality, but what it really is, it's a mind pattern that operates in you. And when you bring awareness to it, you can recognize it as a mind pattern in you. In other words, you no longer believe every thought that arises, that it says. You recognize it's an old pattern that says the same thing that it said 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and it says that all the time, and you recognize it. So in other words, you're not trapped in the thoughts anymore. This is again what the whole thing we are talking about. You don't believe in every thought that comes into your head. What that really means is there's an awareness beyond the thought, and you realize there's the voice in my head saying this again. That's all it is. And when you don't energize it with your identification, it begins to subside. And in this way, you become free of this dreadful burden of having that thing in your head talking to you and making your life miserable. But what matters is the awareness needs to be there that frees you, and because then you become the awareness rather than being the thought, or being trapped in the thought or possessed by the thought. Again, there's a movie that many of you have probably seen called A Beautiful Mind. It's about the scientist. It's actually based on a real person, what happened to him. Quite a genius in his field, but he developed delusions. He saw people that weren't there, whatever it's called clinically, schizophrenia, whatever. And the great thing about the movie is the viewer, up to the point where the protagonist realizes that these things are illusions, the viewer of the movie doesn't know it either. The viewer participates in the illusions of the protagonist. He believes these people are real too, until suddenly the protagonist realizes, oh my God, I'm seeing things that are not there. And then he continues to see these things, but suddenly there's an awareness in him. And so, although these people still appear to him that are not really there, there's an awareness in him there that he's no longer totally reactive to them. He doesn't feed them with his reaction. And gradually, they subside over years. It takes years for them to subside. But the decisive point is, although the word is never mentioned, the decisive point is the awareness, wow. And that's the same thing that applies to any pattern in the human mind, not just a totally insane pattern. Bring awareness to it so that you're not tortured by that. And real compassion always arises out of awareness anyway.
I'm curious about another issue, really strong emotion. For example, like right now, I'm like nervous. There's no reason to be nervous. Nothing bad could possibly happen. How do you overcome emotions like that? And jealousy, hatred, any strong emotion. Do you have any practical tips that we could try for that? Thank you.
Well, first it's helpful to see the connection, which is usually the case between the particular thoughts that you are thinking and the emotion that you feel. Most of the time, the emotions are caused by particular patterns in your mind. For example, anxiety is caused by thinking about possible future things that may happen, or things that you want to happen, but they may not happen. You may not get what you want, you may not get what you need, you may lose what you already have. These things are all mind patterns that create fear. So very often it is the thought that creates the emotion. And the thought creates the emotion because you totally believe in the thought. In other words, you're totally identified with the thought. Then the body responds as if the thought were reality. I might lose my job. If you think that, you wake up in the middle of the night, and then you start thinking more thoughts on those lines. The body can't tell the difference. The body kind of responds to the thoughts that go through your mind. They affect the physiology of the body. I mean, if you doubt that, think of biting into a lemon, and you find saliva accumulating in your mouth. So what you think affects the body. The body believes your thoughts to be real. So when you think that you might lose your job, you've lost your job already, according to the body, and you're destitute. And that's how the body reacts, and that's how the emotion is created. So it's often then by seeing a thought as untrue, that you actually begin to become free. You can only see it as untrue if there's an awareness there that is aware that there is a thought. Without the awareness, there's only the thought. The thought then swallows up your entire consciousness, and there's nothing else you can do then. But with awareness, here's the awareness, and here's the thought. And then the thought may still operate for a while, but it's not empowered anymore, and the emotion then is also going to weaken. There may be times when there's not much thought, as in this, when you just said, when you came up to the microphone, you felt nervous. Perhaps you didn't have any particular thought on this occasion. You just came nervous because many people, when they go up to a microphone and speak in public, feel nervous. And again, in these cases, it's a question of simply acknowledging the emotion and allowing it to be there. As I sometimes put it, you become the space for it. You allow it to be there. So you could step up to the microphone. It's actually what you said is very helpful. When you go to the microphone and you start by saying, I feel nervous, palms of my hands are sweaty because I'm here public. It's the beginning of allowing it to be there without feeling that I shouldn't be feeling nervous. Then you feel even more nervous. But if you allow the emotion to be there, there comes a little space around it. And there's an aware space. Yes, there's nervousness, but there is an awareness around it. So you're not totally in the nervousness. You allow it. And when you share it with others, it's a lovely thing. When you share any emotion in that way with others, rather than inflicting your emotion on them and saying, you did that to me. But when you say, when you said that, this is what I felt. There's an awareness there, rather than, you made me feel this. You can say, when you said that, this is what I felt. Or at this moment, this is what I feel. And everybody loves that, and there's an honesty with that, rather than coming out to the microphone and pretending not to be nervous. It's actually much more powerful, and you connect more deeply. If you're ever going to public speaking, perhaps you will, you connect much more deeply to the audience when, instead of hiding the fact that you're nervous, you start off by saying, I feel really nervous. Then you connect with everybody. If you're pretending, you don't connect. So again, just a brief summary. See what thoughts are causing the emotion, which is often the case, or in other cases, if an emotion just arises, allow it to be the space for it, and it's part of your experience of the present moment, and you might as well say yes to it, because whatever arises in the present moment is as it is already. Whether you argue with it or not, the present moment is always as it is. And that's the isness. And when you become friendly with the isness, that in itself is a transformation of consciousness. Beyond that which we perceive in this room, is there anything else about that we could call the present moment? Well, if you look deeply enough, yes, there is also the inner energy field in your body that you can actually feel, that you're alive in your legs, your arms, your feet. That's also part of the present moment, to sense the energy field that pervades the physical body. That's also something you can feel. So there's external sense perceptions, and there's the feeling the aliveness inside your body. And if you're totally in thinking, you can't feel that at all. You don't feel alive. You're only alive in the upper story of the house, your head. The entire house, you don't inhabit then. So you begin to inhabit the entire body. This becomes part of your experience of the present moment. So sense perceptions, yes. And there is an aliveness even to artificial light. Of course, you might say, I prefer sunlight. Okay, me too. But there's a beauty and aliveness even to artificial light. And there's a beauty and aliveness that is usually overlooked, that's in the texture of this chair here, or whatever you're wearing, and certainly the flowers. And suddenly you become aware of that. And that's not all yet. We're just going into the present moment. So you have that, externals, and you suddenly appreciate the aliveness of all the things that surround you. Other people have to take acid to get there. So you don't need that. Everything is vitally alive, and you miss that if you're totally trapped in the mental noise all the time, taking in information. Present moment, sense perceptions. So the inner energy field of the body, and then what else is there to the present moment? Okay, then you have to become really alert. And the next thing that you notice about the present moment is really at the deeper level of the present moment. It's not something that arises in your consciousness, as does the table and this room and even the inner energy field of the body. These are all objects that arise in your consciousness. But if you go deeper even into the present moment, what you encounter is the most incredible secret of human life, which is you encounter the fact that at the bottom of it all, you are conscious. There is the presence that you are, without which you couldn't perceive anything. You couldn't perceive this room, and you couldn't feel the body without that consciousness that you essentially are, which Jesus, by the way, called the light of the world. He said to his disciples, "You are the light of the world." And these disciples were not special people, they were fishermen. So certainly he wasn't telling them that they are VIPs. They were the opposite of VIPs. And yet he said, "You are the light of the world." He also said it about himself, but he also said it about others. And so you suddenly discover that essentially, at the most essential level, the essence of who you are is consciousness. But consciousness isn't something you can say, there it is. Because consciousness cannot become an object to itself. It's the eternal subject. The I am that I am of the Old Testament, where when God is asked for his or her name, God says, "I am that I am." That is the essential identity of all beings. So when we talk about the present moment, we talk about different levels of the present moment, from sense perceptions to the feeling of aliveness in the inner body, to the realization that ultimately what we call the present moment and the light of consciousness are one and the same, because that's the thing that always remains. And that consciousness, you can sense it as yourself right now, the presence that you are, even beyond the physical presence. And that is the alertness, that is the realization that is sometimes called awakening. And that is the place also of stillness, where you get out of the mental noise. And that is the source place of creativity. that is intelligence that is non-conceptual. It's primordial intelligence. And if you touch that in yourself, then at first as glimpses, as brief realizations, and then gradually integrate it into your daily life, then you can live from that place, the source, and be not only a more productive human being, but also a more peaceful human being, because then you no longer contribute to the conflict in this world, because the conflict is only created by all those humans who don't know that level in themselves. They don't know who they are. And again, to quote Jesus again, on the cross he said, forgive them, they know not what they do. And why do they know not what they do? They don't know who they are, essentially. So this, I've talked about this, and in the hope that as I'm speaking, there is an experience in you of what the depths of the present moment. Because the present moment, people think it's present moment is what happens. And of course, because what happens changes all the time, people say there are many present moments. If you look more deeply, of course, there are not many present moments. There's only ever this present moment. There's only this ever. So there are not many present moments. There's only the space of this moment. So there's what happens in it, and there is the space in which it happens, and that space is consciousness. And that is who you are. And when you realize that, you become free of the false sense of self, which your mind tells you something about who you are, which has to do with your history and your successes or your failures or what other people tell you who you are. A little prison. So that's really basically the essence of spirituality, which is very simple, but for some reason, it's not taught at school. All kinds of inessential things are taught at school. But what really matters, the very foundation of human life, and it's not some belief structure. I'm not saying indoctrinate children, the children must believe. It's not belief at all. It's an experience. It's a realization. That's what needs to be taught. That needs to be subject number one at school. Who am I? And everything else is easy once you have that. For most people, the shift is a gradual process from one state of consciousness to another, and occasionally it happens in some people, as it happened to me, that it happened, well, virtually overnight, the shift from one state of consciousness to another. And I was deeply depressed for many years and close to suicide several times. And that night, as I describe in the Power of Now at the beginning, I disidentified from the thinking mind. It happened, I didn't know that was what was happening. It just happened. I can't live with myself any longer, I thought. It's so dreadful. I can't live with myself any longer. And then suddenly an awareness came in. I didn't know it was called awareness. An awareness came in and looked at the thought. And the thought suddenly looked very strange. The thought seemed to consist of two people, I and myself. I can't live with myself. So then another thought came, am I one or two? And who am I? And who is that self that I can't live with? That's almost a Zen-like question. And like all Zen questions, it didn't really have an answer on the conceptual level. So on the conceptual level, I didn't get an answer. But the answer was that the myself and the I suddenly separated. And I realized, or I couldn't have explained it then, that the myself was the mind-created entity, the me, the poor little unhappy me. It consisted of mind movement, an identity, a mental identity of an unhappy human being with an unhappy history and a very uncertain future, That probably applies to many humans, not if you work at Google, but that there was a separation, and there was an I suddenly that saw that, and that I, years later, I realized what that I was. It was consciousness itself that had, so before there was consciousness and thinking forming a unity. My consciousness was trapped in my thinking. Through the suffering at that night and looking at that sentence, the consciousness separated itself from the movement of thinking, and the self that I couldn't live with was not being sustained anymore by consciousness. It was, and it kind of crumbled. It was a false self that crumbled, and what was left was simply a space of awareness. And the next morning I felt very peaceful, never felt that peaceful before. Nothing had changed in my environment, and I couldn't understand it. It took probably at least 3-4 years before I could begin to understand what had happened. All I realized, I'm suddenly so peaceful. The whole world is peaceful. What's happened? So the mind itself had dissolved, and later I talked to some Buddhist monks and others, and through listening to them, I realized when they talked about the teaching of the Buddha. Later, I also realized that Jesus was talking about the same thing, but I realized the Buddha was talked about the delusional self, the unreality of the self, that the self is not real. It's as it's called in. He talked, there is no self really. Anatta is the word in the Pali language in the Buddhist teaching. It's an illusion. That self is an illusion. And so when I talked to Buddhist monks, I began to realize, that was 3 years later, oh, that must have been what happened. This must be why I feel so peaceful. So understanding came much later, that the realization, it kind of just happened. And then it became a teaching. So I'm now showing to people, this is something that that can happen in your life. But for most people, it's a gradual process of disidentification from the thinking mind, which doesn't mean you don't think anymore. It just means your identity or yourself isn't trapped in it. So the thinking is free of self, and that's very liberating. And you essentially, who you feel yourself to be and who I feel myself to be is not to do with the physical form or my personal history or what I have achieved in life, fortunately, because otherwise you get unhappy. If you, for many years, before I wrote The Power of Now and it became successful, I was basically a failure in the eyes of the world. So he's already almost 50, and what has he achieved? My mom said, you have thrown away your life. You had so many possibilities in your life. You walked out of graduate school in Cambridge. Why did you walk out of there? My mom and many other people said, this person has failed in life. He has no job, he has no insurance policies, nothing, no pension plan, just almost nothing in the bank, failure. And then a few years later, people bought The Power of Now and became a bestseller. Oh, a big success. Okay, if I had derived my identity at that time from what the world was telling me, or my mind would have told me if I had been listening to my mind, I would have been very unhappy. And I didn't, though. I was fine, because my identity wasn't derived from that anymore. And fortunately, even when in the eyes of the world I suddenly became a success, I don't want to derive my identity from that. It's a cheap substitute.